We've all agreed you can't live here anymore." My mother, Diane, said it like she was announcing a new HOA rule about lawn ornaments or trash pickup schedules. It was a Tuesday evening, the kind of ordinary night where the air smells like lemon floor cleaner and the hum of the dishwasher fills the gaps in conversation. I was standing in the kitchen, still wearing my scrubs from the clinic, holding a half-peeled orange. My 4-year-old daughter, Lily, was sitting cross-legged on the rug in the adjacent living room. She was holding her stuffed rabbit by its tattered ear, her strawberry blonde curls catching the light as she looked up. She was watching every single word land on my face like a physical blow. The "we" she referred to wasn't just my parents. It was a committee. My older brother Kyle and his wife Brianna were perched on the sofa, looking like they were attending a high-stakes board meeting rather than a family dinner. My father Marcus wouldn't meet my eyes. He stared at his hands, tracing the calluses on his palms. The air felt thick, heavy, and suddenly very cold. It was a formal eviction masked as a family discussion, delivered with a chilling lack of empathy. That was the exact moment something inside me stopped asking for permission. For years, I had been the daughter who smoothed things over, the one who took the smallest slice of cake and the loudest share of the blame. But as I watched Lily's eyes go wide with a confusion she couldn't yet name, the old autumn haze started to dissolve. My name is Autumn Hayes. I'm 28 years old, divorced and a mother. 2 years ago, when my marriage collapsed quietly and without warning, no big fight, just a sudden realization that I was alone even when he was home, my parents told me to come home. "Just until you get back on your feet," they had said. They offered me my old bedroom and a sense of safety that I desperately needed. I believed them because you are supposed to believe your parents. I thought a family home was a sanctuary, not a business arrangement with a hidden expiration date. I moved in with 2 suitcases, a toddler, and a broken heart, thinking I was being pulled into a safety net. I didn't realize I was actually walking into a trap that would eventually snap shut on my life. The house we were currently standing in wasn't actually my childhood home. It was a new build, bigger, grander, and much more expensive. It had a sharp brick exterior, a manicured lawn, and was located in the kind of top-tier school district that people stretched their finances to reach. My parents had moved here 3 years ago, right before my world fell apart. It was a house designed for status, a symbol of their success in their later years. They had stretched themselves thin to afford the mortgage, wanting to project an image of wealth and stability to the suburban community. At the time, I was happy for them. I cheered when they got the keys, thinking they had finally earned their dream home. I didn't pay much attention to the financial details back then. I was too busy navigating the end of my own life as I knew it. But that detail, the fact that they had stretched to buy this brick-and-mortar trophy, would matter deeply later. It was the foundation of their pride, and as I would soon discover, it was also the crack in their entire structural integrity. They loved the house more than the people inside it. At first, the living arrangement was helpful. My mother would watch Lily for an hour while I ran to interviews, and my dad would fix the occasional toy. But slowly, the atmosphere began to shift. The warmth evaporated, replaced by the frost of passive-aggressive comments. It started with small things. "You're still looking for full-time work, right?" my mother would ask over breakfast, her calm eyes scanning the classifieds. Then it became, "Lily's toys are everywhere. This isn't a daycare center." Or the constant reminder that groceries are expensive these days, even though I bought my own food and paid for the utilities. I worked part-time at a local medical clinic while staying up late into the night, finishing my billing and coding certifications. I was exhausted, drained, and doing my best to be a ghost in their hallways. I realized that in some households, gratitude has a very short expiration date. You are only welcome as long as you are convenient. Once your presence requires even a shred of genuine sacrifice or a change in their aesthetic lifestyle, the open door policy starts to grow a very heavy deadbolt. I was no longer a daughter, I was a guest who had overstayed her welcome. The committee meeting grew more intense as the minutes ticked by. It wasn't just my parents anymore. My older brother Kyle had fully inserted himself into the situation. Kyle had always been the golden child, the one who followed the traditional path and expected the world to bow accordingly. He didn't even look at me as he spoke about boundaries and moving forward. His wife, Brianna, sat next to him, looking absolutely thrilled. She had always resented my presence in the house, likely because it reminded her that the family wasn't as perfect as she wanted it to be for her social media feed. My dad continued to stare at his hands, a silent bystander to my public execution. "You're almost 30, Autumn," my mother said, her voice devoid of any maternal softness. "It's time you moved on so we can have our space back." Lily whispered, "Mommy," and reached for my hand. I squeezed it, keeping my voice steady despite the roar in my ears. "Where do you expect us to go in this market?" I asked. "You have 2 weeks," Kyle said, his tone final and sharp. 2 weeks. They were giving a single mother and a child 14 days to disappear. I didn't argue. I knew from the look on Kyle's face and the set of my mother's jaw that the decision was final. I didn't beg for more time, and I didn't scream about the unfairness of it all. Instead, I picked up Lily, went upstairs to our cramped guest room, and closed the door. I sat on the edge of my bed and cried silently into the fabric of my sweater so Lily wouldn't hear the gasping sobs that were trying to tear out of my chest. My heart felt like it was being squeezed by a cold hand. Lily crawled up next to me, her small hand patting my shoulder. "Are we in trouble, Mommy?" she asked in a tiny, trembling voice. Her question broke the last of my composure, but it also sparked a flicker of something else. That's when the memory hit me, like a dropped plate shattering on a tile floor. It was a memory of a kitchen table 3 years ago, a stack of daunting legal papers, and my father's desperate voice. I remembered a specific conversation about credit scores, income ratios, and a signature that they desperately needed to secure their suburban dream. 3 years earlier, my parents had found this house, but they couldn't qualify for the mortgage on their own. Their credit was decent, but their combined income wasn't enough to satisfy the lender's strict requirements for a loan of this size. At the time, I was working 2 jobs, had perfectly clean credit, and a record of very stable employment. They had come to me, hat in hand, playing the family card with expert precision. "It's for the family, Autumn," they had said. "It's an investment for all of us. You'll be helping us secure our future." They asked me to co-sign the mortgage. I was young, I was eager to please, and I wanted to help my parents get the home they wanted so badly. So I signed. My name sat on that loan alongside theirs. At the time, I viewed it as a favor, a temporary bridge to help them across. I didn't realize then that my name wasn't just a signature, it was a massive legal liability. But more importantly, it was a legal stake in the very ground they were now trying to kick me off of. I wasn't just a resident. I was a pillar holding the roof up. That night, after Lily finally fell into a restless sleep, I sat on the floor with my laptop. My heart was racing as I pulled up the digital mortgage documents I had saved in an old email folder. I scrolled through the dense legalese, my eyes blurring until I found the section I was looking for. There it was in black and white. Autumn Marie Hayes. Co-borrower. Not a tenant, not a guest, and certainly not someone who could be evicted by a committee of relatives. I was equally responsible for every cent of that debt. I took a clear photo of the signature page with my phone, the light of the screen reflecting in my eyes. I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me. I didn't feel like crying anymore. I felt like a person with a plan. I opened my messages and sent a short, professional text to my mother. "If I'm moving out, I'm contacting the lender tomorrow to remove myself from the mortgage. I can't stay financially tied to a house I don't live in." That was it. No threats, no insults, no emotional pleas. Just the cold, hard reality of math. The fallout was nearly instantaneous. My bedroom door didn't just open at 7 a.m. the next morning. It rattled on its hinges as my mother burst in, her face a mask of panicked fury. "You cannot do that," she shouted, her voice high and tight. I was already awake, sitting in the armchair by the window, sipping a cup of lukewarm coffee. I looked at her calmly, feeling a strange sense of detachment. "Why not?" I asked, my voice level. "You'll ruin us," she screamed. "If you pull your name, the bank will see we don't meet the income requirements anymore. You'll force a default or a refinance." I took another sip of coffee, watching her. "No," I replied. "I'm not ruining you. I'm just removing myself from a liability I no longer have a reason to carry. You'll just have to refinance the loan in your own names. Since you want your space back, it's only fair you pay for it yourselves." Silence followed my words, heavy and suffocating. She looked at me as if she were seeing a stranger. The realization was finally starting to sink in. The helpless daughter had teeth. The silence in the room was deafening as the weight of the situation fully landed on my mother. Without my income listed on that original application, they wouldn't have qualified 3 years ago, and the situation was even worse now. Interest rates had risen significantly since then, and their debt-to-income ratio was already stretched to the breaking point. The house they loved so much, the one they used to look down on me, was no longer affordable without my legal presence on the paperwork. Kyle stormed upstairs an hour later, his face red with indignation. "You're being vindictive, Autumn," he barked, standing in the doorway like he could intimidate me into submission. "This is family. You're trying to take away Mom and Dad's home just because you're mad about moving." I stood up, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I'm protecting my credit, Kyle," I said calmly. "If I'm not living here, I shouldn't be liable for a $500,000 loan. If anything happens to their income, the bank comes after me. I'm starting a new life for Lily, and I won't do it with this debt hanging over my head." He had no answer for that. By the evening, the tone in the house had shifted dramatically. The aggression had vanished, replaced by a desperate, sickeningly sweet attempt to backtrack. My father, who hadn't spoken more than 10 words to me in a week, approached me in the kitchen while I was making Lily a sandwich. "You can stay, Autumn," he offered, his voice low and conciliatory. "We talked it over. We were just stressed. There's no need to rush out in 2 weeks. Take your time. Let's just forget about the mortgage thing." I stopped spreading the peanut butter and looked at him. I saw the fear in his eyes. Not fear for me or Lily, but fear of losing his precious brick house. "You decided I was temporary," I said, the word hanging in the air between us like a physical object. "You made it clear that my daughter and I were a burden. You didn't want me. You wanted my signature. I'm not a person to you. I'm a financial insurance policy." I shook my head, feeling a finality I hadn't known I possessed. The 2 weeks still stands, but so does my phone call to the lender. I contacted the lender the following Monday. The process of removing a co-borrower isn't instant or easy, which I knew. The bank was very clear. For me to be released from the liability, the remaining borrowers, my parents, had to prove they could carry the loan on their own. Essentially, they had to apply for a refinance. I provided the bank with all the necessary notices. My parents were forced to submit their current financial documents, and the reality was grimmer than even I had suspected. They had taken out personal loans to furnish the house and were leaning heavily on credit cards to maintain their lifestyle. 2 weeks later, the letter arrived. The refinance was denied. The lender wouldn't release me unless the loan was paid in full or the house was sold, because my parents were a high-risk solo venture. I was already out apartment hunting by then, looking at small, affordable places far away from the suburban sprawl. I didn't feel bad. I had given them my signature when they needed it. I wasn't required to give them my entire future. I found a new place faster than I expected. It was a modest 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of an older building. It wasn't brick, it didn't have a manicured lawn, and it smelled like a mixture of fresh white paint and old carpet. But as I walked through the empty rooms with Lily, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. Lily twirled in the middle of the empty living room, her curls bouncing. "Is this ours, Mommy?" she asked, her eyes wide with wonder. "Yes," I said, and the word tasted better than any revenge ever could. It was small, but it was safe. There were no committees here, no passive-aggressive comments about toys, and no one who could threaten our stability. I signed the lease with my own name, backed by the credit score I had fought so hard to protect. Moving day was quiet. My parents watched from the porch as I loaded my car. They didn't help. They looked at me with a mix of resentment and terror, knowing that my departure was the beginning of the end for their suburban dream. A month after I moved out, the for sale sign went up in their front yard. They had no choice. Without my income to balance the books and with the lender looming, they couldn't keep up with the payments on the new terms. But the timing was terrible for them. The housing market had cooled significantly, and the bidding wars of the previous year were a distant memory. Price drops started within the first 30 days. I heard through the grapevine that the tension inside that big brick house had fractured the family even further. Kyle and Brianna, who had been so vocal about me leaving, stopped coming around once they realized there was no longer a grand house for them to inherit or host parties in. It was funny, in a dark way, how quickly their family loyalty faded once the square footage began to shrink. They weren't there to help pack boxes or stage the rooms. They were gone as soon as the status was gone. My parents were left alone in a house that was too big, too expensive, and rapidly losing value. During this time, my mother started calling me daily. The corporate spokesperson tone was gone, replaced by a high-pitched weeping guilt campaign. "You're tearing this family apart, Autumn," she would sob into the phone. "Your father is depressed, the house is going for a pittance, and it's all because you couldn't just be patient." I would sit in my quiet kitchen, watching Lily color at the table, and feel remarkably unmoved. "No, Mom," I said during one particularly grueling call. "I didn't tear the family apart. You did that when you sat in a room with my brother and decided to make my child feel unwanted. You prioritized a house over your granddaughter. I'm just the one who stopped paying for the privilege of being mistreated." She cried harder, but I didn't join her. I had done my crying in that guest room. Now I was busy building a life where family meant something more than a legal obligation. I eventually had to block her number for a few days just to get some peace. 3 months into my new life, I received an unexpected call from the lender's representative. Because I was still legally a co-borrower until the sale closed, they were required to keep me informed of the status. The news was worse than I thought. The refinance had failed a second time, and because my parents had missed 2 payments while trying to negotiate, they were now facing actual foreclosure timelines unless they sold the house immediately at whatever price they could get. I sat on my sofa after the call, looking at the city lights through my window. I felt something I didn't expect. It wasn't joy, and it wasn't a sense of, "I told you so." It was pure, unadulterated relief. I realized then that this wasn't revenge anymore. It was just a consequence. They had made a series of choices, to live beyond their means, to use me for my credit, and to discard me when I became an inconvenience. Now, those choices were catching up to them. The house wasn't a sanctuary, it was a weight, and I was finally out from under it. Kyle called me privately one evening, his voice shaking with a different kind of anger. "Brianna is furious," he hissed, as if his wife's anger was the ultimate moral compass. "We were planning to move in with Mom and Dad eventually to save for our own place. We were going to take over the upstairs. You wrecked that whole plan, Autumn. You're so selfish." I laughed softly into the phone, a genuine, tired laugh. "So that was the committee's real plan?" I asked. "You were going to kick me and Lily out so you and Brianna could move into the bigger rooms? Your plan was literally to replace me." He didn't deny it, he just sputtered more insults about how I had ruined the family legacy. I realized then that my brother never saw me as a sister. I was just an obstacle to his own comfort. I hung up on him mid-sentence. I didn't need to hear any more. The masks were completely off now, and the people underneath weren't anyone I wanted in my life or my daughter's life. While I was untangling the final mountain of paperwork with my own lawyer to ensure I was protected during the sale, I discovered something else buried in the old records. When I had co-signed 3 years ago, I hadn't just given my signature. I had contributed $18,000 of my own savings toward the closing costs and the initial down payment. At the time, I had thought of it as a contribution to my own future security. But my parents had conveniently forgotten about it once they decided I was a guest. However, because of how the documents were drafted, that money wasn't labeled as a gift. It was recorded as a borrower contribution. My lawyer pointed out the significance with a sharp smile. "This means you are legally entitled to your portion of the equity at the time of sale," he explained. "They can't just take the proceeds and run." My parents had clearly hoped I wouldn't notice or that I would be too nice to claim it. They were wrong on both counts. I was done being nice. I was being fair. I sent a very calm, very formal email to my parents and their real estate attorney. I will expect my documented $18,000 contribution and my proportional share of any equity to be paid to me at the time of closing, I wrote. I have the bank records and the original HUD-1 statement to support this claim. The explosion from Kyle was predictable. He sent a barrage of texts calling me a bloodsucker and accusing me of bleeding our parents dry in their old age. I replied once, "No, Kyle. I'm collecting what's mine. If they wanted to keep the money, they should have kept the daughter who gave it to them." I knew they were counting on that money to fund their move into a smaller place. By claiming my legal share, I was making it even harder for them to maintain their lifestyle. But it wasn't my job to subsidize people who had shown me the door with 2 weeks' notice. I was a mother now, and that $18,000 belonged in Lily's college fund, not in a down payment for my parents' poor next ego trip. The house finally sold. It went for significantly less than they had hoped, barely covering the mortgage and the mounting fees. The market had been cruel to them. After paying the realtor commissions and covering the shortfall from the missed payments, there was barely any profit left over. However, because my $18,000 was a documented borrower contribution, the title company had to return that amount to me before the final profit calculations were distributed to the other owners. To cover the rest of what they owed the bank and the closing costs, my parents had to do the one thing they feared most. They had to dip into their personal savings. Their retirement savings. The very future they claimed I was helping them secure was now being drained to pay for the house they had used to humiliate me. It was a complete financial reversal. They ended up with almost nothing from the sale of their dream home, while I received a wire transfer that changed my life. The aftermath was like a grenade going off in the family tree. Kyle stopped speaking to my parents completely, blaming them for losing the house and ruining his plan to move in. Brianna, predictably, blamed my parents for being weak and letting me win. My parents, in turn, blamed me for everything: the sale, the loss of their savings, and the fact that their son wouldn't take their calls. The family fractured beyond any hope of repair. But as I sat in my apartment, watching the sun set over the city, I realized I didn't feel the weight of their blame. I slept better than I had in years. The house was gone, the debt was gone, and the toxic expectations were gone. I realized that family isn't a blood bond that gives people the right to use you. It's a relationship built on mutual respect. They had broken that bond long before I called the lender. I wasn't the cause of the fracture. I was just the one who stopped trying to hold the broken pieces together. 6 months later, my mother called me. Her voice wasn't screaming or weeping this time, it was just small. "We're in a townhouse now," she said, describing a rental on the other side of town. It was a far cry from the brick mansion in the elite school district. She sounded tired and older than her years. She asked about Lily, and for a moment I felt a pang of sadness for the grandmother she could have been. "Are you happy, Autumn?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. I looked over at Lily, who was sitting at our small kitchen table, humming to herself as she colored a picture of a sun. She looked healthy, she looked safe, and she hadn't asked about Grandma's house in months. "Yes," I said, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. "I'm very happy." I didn't rub it in. I didn't mention the townhouse or the loss of their status. I didn't need to. The silence on the other end of the line told me she already knew. 2 weeks after that final phone call, I received a piece of certified mail. It was a small check, the final equity reconciliation from the house sale after all the legal dust had settled. It wasn't a huge amount, certainly not enough to buy a house, but it was exactly the amount I needed to pay off my car loan entirely. I drove to the bank that afternoon and made the final payment. As I walked back to my car, I felt a strange lightness in my chest. For the first time since my divorce, for the first time in my adult life, really, I had zero debt besides my monthly rent. I had total independence. No one had a signature of mine that they could use as leverage. No one could threaten my housing or my credit. I was 28 years old, and I was finally, truly free. I buckled Lily into her car seat, and we went to get ice cream to celebrate. She didn't know what we were celebrating, but she saw me smiling, and that was enough for her. In the year that followed, my life settled into a beautiful, steady rhythm. I secured a full-time position as a senior medical coder at a large hospital. It came with better hours, full benefits, and the kind of stability I had only dreamed of when I was living in that guest room. I was able to move Lily into a much better preschool district within a year, not because of a stretch mortgage, but because I could actually afford the life we were living. I was no longer looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next committee meeting or the next passive-aggressive comment. No one could hold housing over my head ever again. I had built a foundation out of the very bricks they tried to throw at me. I learned that leverage isn't just about money or signatures. It's about the power to say no to people who treat you like an option. My daughter was growing up seeing a mother who was controlled, capable, and completely her own person. A year to the day after that meeting in the kitchen, Lily and I were sitting on the floor of our apartment, putting together a puzzle. Out of nowhere, she looked up and asked, "Mommy, why don't we live with Grandma anymore?" I knelt down so I was at her eye level, taking her small hands in mine. "Because this is our home, Lily," I said softly, "and no one gets to decide we don't belong in it, ever again." She nodded, a serious look on her face, like that made perfect sense to her. And that's when I understood the final piece of the puzzle. They thought they were removing me from their house to protect their comfort. What they really did was remove themselves from my life, so I could finally find mine. They thought they held the leverage because they owned the bricks. But I held the leverage because I owned the future. And in the end, that was the only leverage that ever truly mattered. I went back to the puzzle, finally feeling like all the pieces were exactly where they were supposed to be.